Well, hello, it's Richard Pears from Finextra TV. And as you're probably starting to know, at sustainablefinance.live, our next conference, we're going to be focusing on the impact of climate change and nature loss on national infrastructure, and what our plans are needed to enable mitigation and adaptations in cities. And we're going to be focusing on energy, nature, just transition. We're also going to be looking at things like artificial intelligence and big data, as well as, of course, the right financial instruments that are going to help us finance our way forward. But we really wanted to look at this through the lens of sustainable cities, and to help us understand why that matters, we've got with me today Professor David Simon. David is the Professor of Development Geography, Director of External Engagement at the Royal Holloway, University of London. Good to see you today.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks very much, and really honoured to have you on board. And I suppose the first question, sustainable in cities, that doesn't seem to go together very well. Why should we be focusing on cities?
Well, put very simply, you cannot have sustainability without sustainable cities, and you cannot have sustainable cities without wider societal sustainability. So the two are inextricably linked. And the most simple reason for that is that the vast majority of humanity now live in areas called towns and cities, defined in different ways, of course, in different countries. And even those low-income countries where the majority of people still live in rural areas are now urbanizing increasingly rapidly. Linked to that, IT and all the other technologies that we come to rely on are making the distance, virtual distance that is, between traditionally rural and traditionally urban areas much smaller, and people are interacting and moving around much more than would have been the case in the past. And crucially, therefore, most emissions now occur in urban areas, with a few exceptions. And crucially, too, for much the same reason, the majority of people experience the impacts of climate change in urban areas. So we have them as sites of the largest emissions and where most people are subject to the impacts, be it sea level rise and storm surges in coastal areas, or increasing heat waves or fire risk or drought, depending on where we're talking about, in rural areas. And we've seen examples of that in the last 2 or 3 years all around the world. And I think the key message is that whereas climate skeptics and others used to say, oh, this is a long-term problem, this is for our children and grandchildren, we now have very clear evidence from all parts of the world that climate change is real, it's here, it's now, and it affects us, not just our children and grandchildren. So we can't kick it down the lane. We've got to deal with it starting right now.
Right. So that makes it actually, in a sense, really crystal clear that there are, this focus. We can start to, if you like, drill in on the cities. So what's stopping that actually being identified and focused on? What are the conditions that we need to change to make the effort?
Well, I think the first thing to say is actually in most countries, cities are at the forefront of tackling climate change. In the UK, the GLA, Greater Manchester Combined Authority and their equivalents, as well as in some of the smaller and intermediate towns, and likewise internationally. They're often way ahead of national governments because of all the things I've mentioned. And crucially, that's where if people are going to get flooded or they're going to get burnt out by a fire, and we've seen the pictures, whether it's from Iberia or Canada, California recent years, Portugal, South Australia, parts of Central Asia, the Siberian tundra increasingly vulnerable to large-scale fires. That's got to be dealt with. Whereas for national governments, they're always balancing millions of things. And traditionally, in many cases, urban areas have not been well addressed by national government ministries. And because cities represent a spatially much more well-defined and constrained area, even if the growth of the city expands beyond the municipal or even the strategic planning authority metropolitan boundary, that more integrated approach to place-based sustainability is much easier to understand and much easier to address in many ways, particularly because of population density, but particularly because of the economic opportunities, the headquarters of companies, the industrial facilities, commercial facilities, and all the rest being in close geographical proximity. And so the trade-offs, the externalities, all those effects are quite visible and are much more readily experienced by people in urban areas, which makes them much more real and perhaps highlights the urgency of addressing it. And whether that's done, again, as in Greater London, in relation to vehicle emissions and the link to public health, and particularly those of children, vulnerable people through asthma and other pulmonary related conditions, or whether it's to address toxic environments through emissions from factories or untreated sewage or industrial effluent contaminating rivers, or whether it's how you deal with storm surges and sea level rise. Again, much easier to do when you have a confined geographical area, you have a clear resource base, and generally reasonably clear mandates and constraints on them. And that's perhaps the segue into the next point, which is, do they have adequate finance to do this themselves?
And indeed, that is the question. And I know that, in the prelim reading you sent me, there's this tension between national government, as you've described there, with the many areas they have to resolve. But there's a problem on the finance front, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I think you can think about that in two complementary, interdependent ways. The first one is whether there's an adequate resource base within a city, from taxes, from user charges, from ability to raise funds or get loans from their respective national governments, or indeed whether they are able to raise capital in their own right. And for historical reasons, and I guess notions of sovereignty, in the majority of countries, it is only national governments that can undertake capital market fundraising. And in terms of official development assistance, or foreign aid, if you like, countries in lower and middle income countries, likewise, those agreements between development donors and development recipients take place on a bilateral basis, government to government, or a multilateral basis from, for example, the World Bank or any of the regional development banks to one or more recipient governments. They're not with regional governments, states, provinces, counties, whatever, or indeed local authorities because of legal constraints. Therefore, the only way that a city in such a country can obtain access to those funds is through good relations with their national government and an agreement that the funding will be channeled through national government to the respective municipality or metropolitan authority. Mm. Where they do have the ability and the autonomy to raise capital, that makes things much easier and more efficient, and of course much more appropriate because they can make it locally specific. Sweden illustrates this very well, where the largest cities, Stockholm, Gothenburg, et al., do have that right. And it's no accident that Gothenburg was the first city in the world to issue a municipal green bond. And that has indeed set the benchmark. Others have now followed. In the last 5 or 6 years, there have been several conferences, there have been several international initiatives around this as a key mechanism, not just for mobilizing municipal funding, but crucially linked to environmental and climate change agendas. And indeed, some of the international city networks like C40 and Resilient City Networks are also working on this issue to try to enable cities to access capital markets in their own right.
So you have multiple stakeholders and multiple silos on the national level. You need a governing authority at the city level, but you also need the access to the finance to allow them to be able to apply that in a planned way. What is your recommendation, if you like, from those conferences, from that Stockholm example? You spoke about sort of green banks and things of this nature. What do we need there?
Well, of course, it's worth pointing out that the majority of towns and cities, and therefore the majority of urban residents, actually live not in the large cities, which have that kind of muscle and internal capacity perhaps to manage such disbursements and to have the assets that act as collateral, which again is one of the constraints that lenders often raise. There's no collateral. So that comes back to how the national setup empowers cities and what can count as collateral in that kind of context. But for smaller intermediate cities that probably don't have the muscle to raise such funds or to access them individually, there is a mechanism that should be facilitated whereby groups of small intermediate cities can actually club together and do this collectively, a kind of co-op, if you like, where 2, 3, or half a dozen, whatever, sign up jointly, and they would most logically be located in the same part of the country, the same region, so that it's facilitated by geographical proximity and similar political and statutory conditions. Then that might make it possible. They might reach the critical mass of all the key variables. But the other mechanism, which is the one you just alluded to, is there have been some proposals in the last 3 or 4 years to develop a green cities development bank or something like that, a World Bank or a regional development bank, but focused specifically on cities, whereas all the others are subject to what I was alluding to a few moments ago, of being essentially at the central government level or intergovernmental level. So this could operate specifically as a multilateral institution designed for and operating in the interests of urban areas and city governments. Again, there'd have to be requirements worked out, there'd be conditions, the ability to have security or collateral will obviously be relevant, but in much the same way as the development finance institutions provide concessionary funding where it's necessary, or do it on commercial terms where concessions are not necessary, that institution would have discretionary powers to calibrate the terms of the deal according to the context of the borrowers, be that an individual city or perhaps a grouping, as I've just explained, of a smaller series of cities located in relatively close proximity.
Understood. And so when we're putting together, you said it's place-based, a city,
Yep.
And we've said this is a fintech publication, so the data matters, the tech matters. When you're starting to put together a bankable project, public-private finance, there's going to be a lot of data needed for the planning and the funding and so on and so forth. So we're focusing on geospatial data, maybe the AI to help us, wrangle some of that complex data. What do you see as the role of, geospatial data in this world that you're describing to us?
Ultimately, we need to use all the tools available, provided that they are helpful and don't exacerbate some of the problems. But I always get concerned when people start talking in very loose terms about smart cities, for example, because it means very different things to different people. And for most people, it's about the Internet of Things and everything being linked up and so on, which might work very well in a high income context. Some of the new rapidly growing cities in the Gulf region, for example, or the Londons and New Yorks and Tokyos of this world, but they don't necessarily make much sense in the most rapidly growing cities in poor or lower middle income countries, where the vast majority of people are absolutely or relatively poor, where they live in shanties or other informal, irregular areas that are either literally or figuratively off the grid, and where there simply isn't that kind of infrastructure. But where it does exist, or where it can be used as part of a package to upgrade facilities and enhance life opportunities, then the idea of smart networks of, for example, air monitoring stations along key roads, key arterials or ring roads, central squares or traffic interchanges, where it can be linked up to temperature monitoring, for example. And these things might be combined, mini weather stations, if you like. So you can build up a network of these monitoring stations at key locations, key intervals across the fabric of an urban area, and they're all being linked through sort of biotelemetry, if you like. So you don't actually necessarily have to have physical cables, but it's all kind of Wi-Fi linked. That transforms your opportunities, because you can capture real-time or just slightly lagged data that covers the whole urban area. In many cases today, people have to go and collect the material from the monitoring stations, then upload it to a computer when they get back to the office and all that sort of thing. So if that kind of set of networks can be established and kept viable so they don't go off grid or offline very quickly with poor weather or lack of maintenance, that can transform things. Similarly with public transport. One of the key challenges, and again, particularly in poorer areas where ability to pay is limited or where densities are lower and commercial operators say, well, it's not worth our while to service those areas off peak because there simply isn't the traffic to support it without massive subsidies. Again, some of the constraints can be alleviated or indeed removed entirely through these kinds of networks of smart monitoring. So they can assess queues, they can assess ridership, loads, and so on in real time and send additional vehicles there or take them away, divert them. It could perhaps be linked to changing the cycles of traffic lights so that there's priority given on a much more rapid basis to vehicles in bus lanes for buses, taxis, paratransit, and so on, which again increases the attractiveness and the efficiency of public transport relative to private, and then in turn, as a second order impact, disincentivizes people to continue using private transport because it's slower. Therefore, people will get onto public transport if it's flexible, if it's efficient, and of course, affordable. So again, several things need to come together. But I think in all those, and there are many other examples that one could give, that idea of geospatial data, widespread monitoring, possibly linked to artificial intelligence for big data analysis of the volumes that conventional mechanisms wouldn't simply manage. This can then transform the opportunities and the ability to respond. For example, if air quality exceeds a certain WHO safety threshold, then they can immediately intervene rather than, as in Singapore and Hong Kong and other places that have these kinds of controls, vehicles with even numbers in the number plate can go in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, odd numbers on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, for example, as one means of demand. Or, you know, with tolls, for example, peak and off-peak, you can adjust tolls. Well, you can use an equivalent mechanism in real time if you've got the air quality monitoring facilities and the congestion monitoring, and you can combine them, and then you can close certain routes, or you can quadruple the toll or whatever to reflect a combination of congestion and air quality monitoring.
And do you see a role for, you've spoken a lot more about the sort of sensor level analysis there, you know, space-based satellites, which obviously can monitor things like greenhouse gases. You've obviously got Earth systems being, you know, modeled. Do you see a role for those in, if you like, the identification of issues and the planning of adaptation of cities and monitoring going forward?
Absolutely. One of the most exciting areas that I've dabbled in a little bit is the idea of citizen science, which is involving ordinary people who don't necessarily have an academic or a scientific or even a technical training. They might be ordinary residents. They might be residents in one of the shantytown areas that is, you know, off the electricity grid and off the pipe water grid, for example, I alluded to earlier. There's a lot of work that's been done in different parts of the world in a kind of joint co-production sense that involves them not just as being the objects of data collection, but actually active data collectors using their great local knowledge of the informal alleys and streets or whatever, where there are water standpoints, where there aren't, and so on, collecting this data, working with town planners, with advocacy groups, with NGOs, and jointly producing high resolution maps of those settlements in a way that has never been possible before. And crucially, it's ground truth. So it adds all sorts of layers that your remote sensing satellite image or even drone image wouldn't be able to capture. And so you combine these technologies, these opportunities, and then you can actually involve them and consult them on where to locate the improved infrastructure or introduce primary healthcare clinics or you know, a branch of a local bank or whatever the key services that they deem to be lacking.
Do you think we're talking about just transition, and our focus will be on looking at, you know, behavioural data and behavioural science? Do you think that sort of level of engaging the citizen is key not only for the identification but also the participation and engagement of communities?
Absolutely, and in a funny kind of way, a lot more work in this area has been done in low and middle income countries, perhaps linked to aid or the sorts of initiatives that I've just alluded to, where there are international alliances of community-based groups in so-called shanty towns and slum areas in a quite activist way, but working with international NGOs. And they've done a lot of this really rather path-breaking work, assisted by the likes of high-tech companies or one or two university research institutes on urban sustainability who act as the integrators, if you like, the knowledge brokers across the different stakeholders. But even in high-income areas, one of the things that, as people are well aware, that bedevils responsiveness and accountability nowadays is what's often called the democratic deficit. The idea that many people have got bored with and been tuned out by the notion of democracy, meaning going to a polling station and casting a vote once every 3 years for your municipality or 4 or 5 years, whatever, for your national government. And that's the end of it. And then they go off and do their thing. They do whatever, however accountable or transparent or otherwise it might be. And then they come back with all sorts of promises by the next election. But actually, a lot of work now is trying to overcome that problem and the alienation and sense of disenfranchised by marginalized minority groups, particularly again in poorer areas, by much more proactive interventions under the broad label, if you like, of deliberative democracy. And actually, I'm just finishing a project with our local borough council right now, and will, with a colleague, be presenting it to the council later this week on creating a citizens panel. And again, there are multiple different variants, and we've done the study for them to examine the evidence from all around the world and these different models and different structures. What are the pros and cons? What would this look like in the particular context of this borough council, its demographic structure, population structure, the geometry of the borough and so on. And then we've set out pros and cons of different alternatives, and then it's up to them to make a decision. But the idea there fundamentally is that they will consult actively with the resident population several times a year, either on general issues, what do you like about what the borough council does, what don't you like, are there things we should be doing better, are there things we're not doing at all? That's a general study, but then also with a large enough panel, you can choose subgroups of it to reflect one particular ward. If there's a road improvement scheme, or people agree that the town centre needs regeneration, and there are several ways that might be done. Or if we're going to regenerate the town centre, what would you prioritise amongst a bunch of competing options? And so you can structure these things. You can do them much more frequently. You can get them right down to the small scale of focus groups or larger ones. You can do them online surveys, telephone interviews, face-to-face, or a combination. And that's really, really important, because our surveys and the work and the evidence from the literature shows that different people respond in different ways. So the elderly, who tend, as a generalization, to be less internet savvy, perhaps much more likely not to be connected or be familiar with the internet at all, they much prefer face-to-face surveys and interaction, whether in their homes or at some sort of community venue. It's also social, and that adds other values for them. Many young people wouldn't dream of doing anything like that unless it was online. Assuming they're of the group who are not completely marginalized, disaffected, offline, and everything in between. And so what we have, again, coming back to your earlier question about geospatial data and the technologies, is the ability to do these things in a much more flexible way, tailored to the preferences of the majority of particular demographic segments or geographical regions, demographic and geographical, and therefore hopefully to be more proactive and ultimately engage people more actively, increase their sense of satisfaction and a sense that they're getting value for money for their taxpayers' pound, dollar, euro, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, Professor Simon, I think we could talk about this all day long, and we're going to have to draw a line there. But there's great food for thought for those getting involved with the conference and the hackathon. I think they'll come back to this interview time and time again for ideas. So for now, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.